This podcast episode was originally recorded for the Healing Souls podcast and is being refurbished for your enjoyment.
Hello, this is Natasha Helfer, and this is the Healing Souls podcast. I am super excited to have a dear friend, Julienna Viegas. I don't think I ever say your last name correctly, so you can correct me.
You're good.
I'm super excited to have Julienna because, in a sense, you encapsulate pretty much everything I want Healing Souls podcast to be about.
Oh, thank you.
And we're going to talk about that a little bit, about the intersectionality that you bring to, your fascinating story. But before that, I just want to give a little bit of an intro. So Julienna was raised in the LDS faith, which is kind of made more colloquially known as Mormonism. She was raised primarily in Belgium in her growing up years. She graduated from BYU with a bachelor's in international politics. She works and lives in Texas with her 3 children. She is currently a support specialist for nursing students at nursing.com. She's written several articles and been on several podcasts about faith transitions in particular. She is currently the host of the Faith Transition podcast, and she will be presenting next week at the Southern Methodist University, who is hosting a conference called Spiritual Abuse, Recognizing, Presenting, and Healing, which will be a conglomerate of therapists, clergy, and survivors that will be talking about what spiritual abuse is and kind of how to help people through those kinds of themes. So, is that a good enough intro?
Yes, that's great.
Is there anything I'm
Thank you.
So the reason why I feel like you're perfect for this podcast is that, in my practice, I'm typically working with people who are coming out of maybe conservative or more traditional or even religious backgrounds, and they're typically in what I call second half of life, which is like 35 forward. So there's a lot of developmental stage stuff going on in that particular stage of life. Anyway, even if you don't come from those kinds of backgrounds, where you're trying to recreate yourself. And so you've been through a lot of recreation, I think, over the last decade. I know that you've been kind of, like I said.
Yes, less than a decade. Last few years, I would say.
Yeah.
Yes.
You've of course moved, throughout your life you've lived internationally, and of course you're in the United States, you're a permanent resident here in the United States. So there's been a lot of intersection between religion, politics, relationships, personal relationships. I know you've been through a divorce. So yeah, I'm super
a lot
excited to talk to you.
Anyone can come to me. No. Yes.
So why don't we start with your personal story a little bit? Just tell us a little bit about yourself and, of course, now with hindsight, how you would look back at your developmental years and the stories and narratives that kind of played a huge role in how you made life, etc.
Well, as you said, I was, born and raised in Belgium. My mother was divorced when I was very young. So at the time, the Mormon missionaries came to her. I was about 4 years old, and she just, kind of embraced it. She was kind of seeking for like a church home, and she had tried different ones and never got satisfied. So when they came, for some reason, it just, felt right to her. And so she joined the Mormon church. And to be fair, it was a happy childhood for me. Our work congregation I had friends, I was very involved, I was a firm believer, and, I enjoyed it very much. So, I followed the course of, I always wanted to go on a mission because the missionaries had been a huge impact in our family. She continued years after years to invite them over, on Sunday for meals and things like that. And so they became kind of this, I used to think of them as being angels, like they were just so good and doing good in the world. And I wanted to do that when I grew up. So going on a mission was definitely part of, what I had always planned since I was very little. So I did end up going and serving on Temple Square in 99 through 98, 99. I served on Temple Square. So I did the visitor center, showing people around, and
if
anyone who's
City,
yes,
wants to see one of the iconic kind of historical things, you've probably been to Temple Square. You probably have been on the other side of people like what you were doing.
Yes. And part of that was also to go and do the regular, knocking on doors, writing by missionary work. So we would leave during the winter time for about 3 to 4 months. And I ended up being in the Oregon Portland mission and the Washington, Vancouver area for, about 3 months or so, and did the regular missionary work as well. So that was, the missionary years, and everything, was kind of fine. I enjoyed the mission at the time, and came back to Belgium, and then went back to study at BYU on a scholarship. I studied, international relations, political science. Again, I was very devout all that time that I was there. So, nothing was really wrong or anything like that. Then got married my last year at BYU, moved to Houston, where my ex-husband went to law school, and we had our first couple of kids there, and then took a job transfer to Switzerland, where we lived for about 7 years. And it's during that time that things started, the pieces started moving a little. My ex-husband went through a faith crisis prior to me, and I was kind of in denial. I didn't want to know anything about it. And so he kind of went through that alone, which I really felt really bad about later on, because it's a very painful thing. So, he came across, he had colleagues asking him questions. And one day, one of his colleagues asked him, well, did you know Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon with, a stone in a hat? And he didn't even know that. And he's pioneer descent. And, it's like, no, that's just, it's just not true, And then he went and did his own research and found out it was true. And then from then he read Rough Stone Rolling, and that kind of opened the whole, rabbit hole for him. And yeah.
Right. So for people who aren't maybe as familiar with Mormonism, Mormonism is kind of a unique religion in regards to it's fairly new historically. So, if you're Catholic, or if you're Muslim, or you've had more time, I think, to deal with some of the historical narratives, right? And also it's probably easier to say, oh, well, 500 years ago, people were kind of wonkadoodle. Then it's not as easy when it's like, well, 60 years ago or less than 100 years ago, these things that I thought were one way were kind of presented one way, but not necessarily historically accurate. So a lot of people in the Mormon religion currently are kind of dealing with those complications. And you're kind of stating something that happens a lot, which is typically couples don't go through faith transitions at the same exact time. And some stay that way forever, where one will stay kind of believer or devout, one will not. And then other times there's shifts and changes, but they don't happen at the same time. So that's complicated.
It gets complicated. And I do know today, friends and people who have, what we call mixed faith couples, as you know, where they have to navigate that, where one believes a certain way, then the other doesn't. And it can be very tricky. So from then, it took me a couple of years to kind of have my own, faith questioning and crisis and transition after him, and I don't want to go through like all the details, because like you mentioned, I do have a podcast, and I've been on Mormon Stories, which with John Dellin, which he has all the podcasts and everything. So I have episodes on there. If people want to know, details about my stories, you can basically Google my name and find out everything. So I'm going to skip some parts.
About,
the whole,
we'll make sure
and
link
thing.
to a lot of that too, so that people can find more about you, because it is. She's super interesting and lovely to listen to.
So for people who are really intrigued and really want to know like all the details, there's plenty of information about that. So basically I went through, just to make it a little bit short here, I went through my own faith transition starting in Switzerland, and I started questioning a lot. And I at that point, I started going kind of dismantling everything that I had built my life upon. So that was a pretty rough patch there. And I was vocal about it. I wrote articles that I shared in the Salt Lake Tribune, and participated in all these podcasts and whatnot to tell my story, mostly so that people who were going through the same thing could also feel that they were not alone. Because again, remembering how my ex went through that alone and the suffering that he went through, which I see hindsight, I would, attribute it to everything else but the faith transition, oh, he's depressed, it's work, it's kids, it's, whatever. But really, a lot of it was caused by the faith transition. So I think even today, some people are still suffering on their own because they don't have a place to go and share or people around them that they can share with, because either they're part of the religion or, so it's important to me that people know that they do have access to people like you, Natasha, and other people who are willing to validate what they're going through. So that's something, we did mention at the beginning. I've also kind of volunteered to be a part of, Thrive. I don't know if, you're familiar with what that is. And so we have a little branch here in Dallas as well, where, once a month I will be the facilitator, with people who want to come in and talk about their faith transition or, what they're going through. So we do hold that here as well.
Yeah, Thrive being kind of a movement or a support group. There was a Thrive conference, I think, that you participated in about a year and a half ago or so.
Correct. Last November.
Yeah, and so there's some like Zoom support groups and things for people who yeah, because it's interesting how faith transitions, I don't know that we talk about them a lot in the context of mental health. And I don't know if people know, but in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, in the back, there's kind of like not diagnoses, but stressors, life stressors that people can be going through. Like you can't be diagnosed with a divorce, right? But but divorce is back there kind of with this idea that if people are going through a divorce, that maybe have implications for their mental health, and religious transitions are back there in that section, because really if you're having some type of faith or religious shift, it has everything to do with your identity, with how you see yourself, how you see your place in the world, how you understand the meaning of life. I mean, there's just so many aspects of that have to do with every aspect of your identity. And I think you can probably relate to that really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, this is why, the conference that I'm doing next weekend with, organized by the Southern Methodist University here in Dallas, I really am super excited that, therapists and clergymen are wanting to look into this from, a therapeutical perspective and how we can help these people. Dr. Cindy, Owen Matthews that I mentioned is really working hard on helping people to be more aware that it's something that's happening ongoing, throughout a lot of faiths that are considered, very demanding, very on, a bit fanatical and, that's, it's something it's a field that needs to be developed, that now all therapists also are familiar with, are comfortable dealing with, people going through these kind of things. So I'm excited that they're developing that field kind of aggressively, which is great.
Well, there's a large movement of people, as we can see through the Pew Foundation and things, where they're doing surveys where people are leaving organized religions. And I like that you termed, the high demand. So high demand religions are the ones that people seem to be probably leaving the most. And that's not all religions are the same. And
right.
If you're part of a religious community that's fairly flexible and fairly accepting, and you can be gay, or you can be a feminist, or you can have types of things that are supportive of your identity, then those religious communities tend to do fairly well in that regard. I think it's the religions that are more rigid or strict in how you can present as a certain gender, or your sex, or your orientation, or just your philosophies in life that are struggling more.
Exactly. So, so where do we go from there? So I went through this transition, and then a little bit after that, so we're in Switzerland. I go through this transition, and then we move back to the US because we have family here and we've been gone for a long time, and the grandparents want to see the kids and everyone wants to be a part of the family life. And so it's at that point, I'm still kind of in between, but then, eventually I leave, and then comes to find out, mean, things are a bit rocky in my marriage, and we end up divorcing amicably. And after, not too long after, my ex-husband came out as gay. So that was also a big transition that we needed to, help navigate, and the kids in the midst, the 3 children. So wasn't so much the fact that, he was gay, but the fact that we also live in a very conservative place here in Texas, where the children didn't really know, who they could tell, who they could not tell. I mean, now they're pretty comfortable, like not knowing who they can open up to and who they don't. But that was something that, we had to all work together as a family to also navigate through that.
Yeah, that's something that we're definitely feeling in the politics and transitions of our country. It's been interesting to see developments in the last 15 to 20 years with legalized marriage and, different types of approaches to sexual orientation. And it's very much still in the national narrative, some very opposing views about all of those things. So if you're living in a conservative area, I can imagine that that's fairly threatening for your family to have to manage that.
Well, luckily, I must say that we have been surrounded by very open people, regardless of, their political views, like personally. Like we have friends that are, very open and whatnot. And we don't really have those discussions that much. I think the kids in school and with their friends are maybe seeing more of the different opinions like hitting them, and they've learned to somehow navigate. But it's also great to see the rising generations do see the world a little bit differently. They're more open. They're constantly, I think, seeing the world on a global level because, they're cyber kids. They're always connecting online, and they are aware of kind of the whole world and, different nationalities. And so, there has been ups and downs, but mostly it hasn't been super hard. I mean, I think for my ex, it's a bit of a different story because, we're like in the suburbs and it's pretty conservative, and I don't know, it may not have been as easy to navigate. But I mean, it's kind of a roller coaster of, knowing how to take things and not be overly reactive, which I can be sometimes with the politics and whatnot. Whoever knows me or like Google my name will find out that I do tend to kind of shout my opinions at times. But yeah, you just kind of learn to navigate through that, right? And not focus too much on the negative, I guess. Otherwise, I mean, we live in a time, I was thinking about meeting with you earlier on, and thinking about just everything that's happening. And it's like, okay, I hope I don't cry, because Natasha is very in touch with, what's happening and everything else. And you have to, you're a therapist. So you take on, people's pain and people's hurt, but just dealing with so much right now, whether it's politics, whether it's racial tension, whether it's COVID and the amount of people dying. And I don't care if it's mostly old people, it's people dying. Like, I don't like when people kind of dismiss, I mean, not a lot of people do, but it seems like sometimes it's like, well, it's the old and sick, and it doesn't matter who. It's just not okay to have that many people die in such a short time. It's just not okay. And I have had, family members affected and friends, and I know people who have died. And so it is personal to me, all these things. And just, it's an interesting time trying to navigate through it all and trying to, at the same time, not be down and negative all the time. That's definitely something I am constantly working on, like just try to balance, and especially for the children to, give them hope, because it can look at times kind of very gloomy.
Sure.
And
yeah.
So, but you have to find those moments of sunshine and things to, we need to stay kind of happy about. And so it's a weird, I don't know, how have you gone through that and lived that? Like this balancing between like, oh, this is awful, and okay, I can't just be depressed every single day, because that doesn't work. That doesn't work. How do you do it?
That's a good question. That's good for you to turn something on me. Now I have to think.
Oh
Yeah, I
boy.
think it's challenging. I mean, I think in the field of psychotherapy, way before COVID, I think 2020 has been a particularly challenging year. You
Mm-hmm,
know, I think
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
internationally, nationally, it's just been challenging for so many of us for so many different reasons. But in general, as a therapist, I mean, I've been a therapist for almost 25 years now. So these topics of like secondary trauma and self-care and how do you sit with story after story after story of people who, like you say, are in pain or have experienced, you know, really difficult challenges and are trying to heal. And so you have to, I think, if you're going to go into this field, you know, figure out how to create that balance in your life. And it's something that I think as a profession, we try to address on a fair, I can't think of a conference I haven't been to that has at least one session on therapeutic self-care, you know,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and
I
knowing
would
our
hope
own
so. Yeah.
limits, you know, knowing our own limits, how many clients a day can I really manage seeing? Do I have other hobbies and interests? Do I have a good support network, you know, that I can count on? Am I able to at some level compartmentalize so I can leave work at work, or, you know, do I bring some of that stuff home with me, and being aware, having supervisors and mentors that you know, that
Mm-hmm.
help you. So I mean, there is a lot, I think, just in my field where we have been considering these types of issues for a long time. But yes, this has been a challenging year. And I think I'm at a place in my life, you know, I'm also in second half of life. And I think one area that I feel like I have personally done fairly well on, not perfect on, but is just being able to accept crap in my life.
Yes,
You know,
yes,
just being able to
yes,
sit and have a good cry, or have a day
yes.
where I feel kind of shitty, or have a moment where I'm just enraged. And instead of
Mm-hmm.
going, oh, I shouldn't do that,
Yeah,
or what's
yeah,
wrong with me, or why
yeah.
can't I get my life together? I'm like, yeah, I'm just having a moment, and that's
Yes,
okay, you know?
it absolutely, absolutely. No, I think it's a skill that, in fact, that's another thought I had as I was thinking about a meeting with you today, is how on a daily, it's like resilience. Like, how do you keep on building that resilience and compassion at the same time for self and others? Because otherwise, I mean, personally, I have this tendency to slide into the negative, you know, and so I have to really consciously think about, okay, how am I going to be resilient today? How am I going to show compassion towards me and my kids and around me, you know?
Yeah.
Because it's just feeling like you just hit, you know, constantly hit and hit. Like I'm struggling because I'm also kind of homesick. Like I'm not American. So I'm like, why do I have to deal with this crap? You know,
Mhm.
I did not grow up with that, you know, and yes, I'm a Black woman. So I feel maybe a little different about everything that's happening as well. And I, you know, I have a moment of anger because I don't want to talk to my kids about this stuff, you know, but I have to because they hear it all the time. I hear it all the time. And so these kind of things make me kind of angry, but I have to find ways to, okay, calm down, just, you know, be rational. You are surrounded by, you know, loving people, family, friends. So don't just bring all that in if you don't have to. But again, you know, limit the news and stuff. Again, for me, as I consider myself a social scientist, you know, with the political science international background, I kind of want to know. Like, I feel bad when I don't know what's going on, but I really have to force myself not to know sometimes, or not to pay too much attention. So it's maybe an extra effort for me.
Yes.
But
Well, and
yeah.
that moderation piece that you're talking about, I mean, you have your professional self that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, for example, would be looking at racial tensions, but you have your own lived personal experience, you know, and you're having to live that every day. And I think when I'm talking to my Black colleagues and friends, that's the piece that it's like it's in your face every day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you willing to talk a little bit about that? I mean, because that's a big part
Yes.
of identity, you know, and as
Yeah.
you have shifted from kind of your original faith tradition, and also you're in second half of life. So what are you noticing as far as both politically and also racial tension wise? How do you think about these things differently than maybe you would have a decade ago?
So I was pretty, you know, it's kind of strange because I was pretty conservative in my beliefs, you know, having grown in the Mormon church, which is generally pretty conservative majority, but I was also not in the US. So I growing up in Europe, you have that overall liberalism that kind of, it's like this blanket that you're in. And so it was also part of me, right? So even though, I didn't believe marriage for, gay people was okay in the eyes of God, I was still very accepting and open because I lived in a society where it was accepted anyways. Or as today, I'm that the conservative part of me has gone down quite a bit. There are still some things that I'm, I would consider myself more conservative. I'm not a full on, let it all happen, all, and not to say it's good or bad. It's just how I am, right?
Sure.
So, but yes, definitely there has been a shift where I've become more and more accepting of people's stories, of people's differences, of people preferences. I mean, it was a huge wake up call for me because when I say I was very conservative, I was on kind of the bad side of it, quote unquote, because I remember when one of my sister-in-law came out back in, I want to say 2007, 8, something like that. And I was still very much a conservative person in the church. I was super upset. I was so upset that I did not talk to her for a long time. Not upset because she came out as gay, but upset because she had, 4 daughters, and how is she going to do that? And, she should just kind of forget about herself. And, but who am I to say that? Who am I to think like that? But I did. And later on, I came to, as I was, you evolve, and I'm also, as I explained in some of my podcasts or whatnot, I was doing some work on developing myself, being more authentic, listening to what I really thought and believed rather than what had been taught to believe or think. I was kind of breaking that down for some reason, as I was reading Brené Brown and The Road Less Traveled and books like that really kind of poke you and challenge you to really discover who you are deep down and who is it you want to be. As I was doing all of that, I came across, some of the testimonials of LGBTQ people, mostly young people who had grown up in the LDS church, and I was reading their experiences and I was just devastated. They were not even like complaining about their upbringing, but just telling their stories just moved me so deeply that I started digging and digging and digging, understanding more of their stories and realizing I have been on the wrong side of things. And that, I think that was one of the biggest trigger of me starting on that road of, ultimately leaving the LDS church. So at that point, I also, wrote a long letter to my sister-in-law, apologizing for, my behavior. And I started becoming more open. And it's interesting because at that point, I don't even know my ex is like gay. I didn't even know, because he was also keeping it all to himself and, trying to come to term with all that. But
yeah, the secrecy of sexual orientation is a very, very common story across a variety of backgrounds and traditions.
Absolutely. Sure. All over the world. It really goes to show how just traditional, the roles of, men and women and how things should be. And because of lack of knowledge also, I think we can thank science for showing, the variety and differences in human sexuality, because without that, we are just trapped in our just belief systems that sometimes are so wrong. But yeah, I am grateful. I mean, things are not perfect, but I am grateful that we do live in a time where knowledge is pushing against beliefs that are harmful, and science shows, you can't discuss when it's shown by A+B that this is how it is. We are not all the same. We do not function all the same. We do not all have, and it's not me saying it, it's the science saying it,
Right. What impact do you think your belief shifts and your ability to kind of see things from a different perspective, which, by the way, is impressive, right? I mean, humans, we resist change. we
do.
we typically like confirmation bias, which means we seek
Oh,
out information that's pretty much
yes.
already aligned to what we already think and
Yes.
believe. That's a
Because
very
it's
good,
painful. It's
yeah,
painful to realize that you've been wrong, especially when it's for a long time or decades. It's painful.
yes.
I mean, one book that I always bring up that was very helpful to me was Catherine Schultz's Being Wrong. I don't know if you read that book,
I have not.
but it really helps you get comfortable with being wrong
Yeah.
and use it as a springboard to something better and greater, because it's just like failure in life. You learn from your failure. You can be a better person because of your failures, because of what, and as humans, we do have a really hard time, especially when you look at, I won't name names or point fingers, but when you look at leaders and leadership, admitting wrong is just, no, I'd rather lie. And that to me is
Well,
really,
we as
really
a
detrimental.
culture, yeah, we as a culture here in the United States, for some reason, have kind of leaned towards this idea that if you change your mind or if you admit you're wrong, that somehow that's a sign of weakness,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
and that's
mm-hmm.
really problematic. I
It
mean, it
is.
takes a lot of strength and
Mm-hmm.
resilience
Absolutely.
and
It's a sign of courage.
ability
Mm-hmm.
to say, oh, I,
Yes.
maybe I need to think about that a little
Yes.
bit
Yes.
differently.
And
That's
I mean, at every level, right? At every level,
yes.
because even as a parent, when I don't raise my kids perfectly. And sometimes, like yesterday, I had a moment in the car and I didn't like what my daughter was wearing and I was kind of shouting a little. And I had to
That's
come
how I
back
shout
and
at my kids
say,
too, by the
a
way.
little. But you know what? I was proud of myself for going back just not too long after and saying, hey, kiddo, I'm so sorry. That was not appropriate. I should not have, talked to you that way. Yes, I mean, I still disagree with this, but that was not right. And you know what? It feels good. I feel good about myself every single time I apologize to my kid because I didn't act the right way, because it's going to happen over and over. But I want them to know this is not who I am. This was my mood at the moment,
Mhm. I think one
So,
of the best things parents can do is apologize. You're role
yes,
modeling. You're, sharing you're showing respect. Again, I think a lot of times parents think that they're going to lose authority if they
yes,
apologize.
yes.
And actually, I think you gain a lot of authority and
Yes, and I
respect.
think church leaders act like that a lot, where they will not admit wrong because they think they're going to lose, the trust and whatnot. It's like, especially when people just know you were, like it doesn't make you look any better to not
Yeah,
admit wrong,
yeah,
It's,
exactly.
it's, it's just, yeah.
So going back
So,
to my
yes.
question then,
Oh,
as far as
sorry. I keep
identity,
going on
no,
tangents.
I didn't even ask it because I got lost in a tangent because it's so fun to talk to you. But how do you think it affected your identity as a woman in
Hmm.
particular, maybe as a Black woman, and
Hmm.
also
Hmm.
your own sexuality and your sense of kind of, I think we get a
Yeah.
lot of messages about
Right, right, right.
womanhood and how we're
Yeah.
supposed to be as a sexual being.
Yeah, so this is a very packed question, because looking at the race side of it, it's really coming to the US that makes me think about that, because I never thought that way before. And not to diminish or disregard or, the experience of Black African American woman, I respect, and I understand to a certain level, but I can also not appropriate the experience because it is not my experience, if that makes any sense.
As
But
an
again,
American Black woman is what you're saying. You're
yes,
coming from a different
yes, I
Black
come
experience.
from a different background, knowing my ancestry all to, like, for a long, long time, like even in Africa, like because of the way my family's set up, like I have mixed in me, like my grandfather's Portuguese, white, went to Africa, married, a village chief woman, or I don't know if she was queen of the village or whatnot, but that they were more prominent in the community because, well, they were expensive clothes in the 1800s, which, in Africa, either you have a cloth on, or if you have like any kind of, expensive clothes on, that means you're someone of stature. So because of that, we were able to find more information about, my ancestry and whatnot, which my sister is now like digging a whole lot since my mother passed. Yeah. And then on the European side, of course, it's a lot more easier to find out, where my family comes from. So I have that, and also I grew up in Belgium where, yes, they have their own crazy story of what the horrific things they've done in the Congo, but they did not bring it so much in Belgium, where it's a different dynamic. There is not racial tension like here in the US. And so basically it's been a strange experience for me, because of course when I walk out on the street, no one knows, and I'm probably I'm the same as everybody else. But I had to dig into those stories, and it's been very, very painful for me to dig into those stories and slavery and everything that has happened, and relating. I mean, that could definitely have been me. So I don't know. I feel it at a different level. I don't know if I'm making sense here, but what has been the most painful for me is having to tell these stories to my kids, and having them, who are living here and growing up here in the US, dealing with that. They're mixed kids. My ex-husband is white, so they're mixed, but here in America, they're Black. So that, we have to explain what that means, to them. And, but luckily they've lived all around the world, and they are very accepting, self-aware. Like, I don't know how to explain, like they have a lot of confidence, like they feel like they can say anything about both, sometimes good and bad, which is not always, I'm like, no, you cannot use the N word because you're half Black, that's not okay, but like they're just kind of funny that way. Like they feel like they have green light on both sides on everything, good and bad. But yeah, personally,
fairly
also
empowered kids, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, I try to, and they're very inquisitive. They ask a lot of questions. Their father, who's, white, has felt very much kind of the duty to teach them from the time they're very little about the whole American history and what. I'm like, just wait, they're still little. Don't tell them all these horrific stories. But he feels like they need to know everything, and they need to be prepared for, people reacting or doing different things. They're doing fine. So my personal identity, I do feel more empowered today, as far as like definitely my sexuality and being divorced and being able to explore if I want to. Like, I'm very afraid of STDs, so I'm not like super adventurous, but I don't feel like I have any specific rules that I have to follow, or and that to me it's great. I don't, since I love the church, I don't have this fear of what's going to happen to me after I die, or going to hell or stuff like that. So it's liberating. Like, I feel like there was a deep cleaning in my brain that was very, very good.
That's really interesting. Well, and so much of what you're saying is kind of this movement from an external authority, which is oftentimes what religious traditions or family of origin or even governments, can be pretty strong external authorities in your life. And you've really moved into an internal authority type of space, like decisions from within, and what feels good to you, what's aligned with your values, what's aligned with your quality of life, and what you're interested in. So that's fabulous.
Absolutely. It's very, very liberating to just, be good for goodness sake, do the right thing because of, real consequences, and not heavenly consequences, which that doesn't mean anything to me today. Being a good person means something to me. Teaching my kids to be good people means something to me. Whatever happens after we die, I'll find out. When I die, I don't care.
Right.
Yeah.
Super interesting. Well, so then let's move into this kind of spiritual abuse language, right? You're going to this conference. As we were preparing for this conversation, you had mentioned that the first time you heard that term, you were a little bit uncomfortable. So just, talk to me a little bit about what that means to you, how you understand the definition of that, and what implications that has for your story.
So as I was telling you earlier, like my friend, Dr. Cindy Owen Matthews, is the one who introduced me to that, term. I had her on my podcast, which you should go and listen, because she has a fascinating story as well, growing up in the church, and the kind of abuse, spiritual abuse she got growing up in the church, from a very conservative father who was very domineering, and then leaders in the church trying to kind of dissuade her because she wanted to really, excel. And she's a very intelligent woman, and she wanted to excel in school and go as high as she could. And she has a PhD, and how you see that the man around her in the church context were trying to, dissuade her and look down on her. So anyways, she's the one who also, studying this field to help other therapists to better understand and better help their patient. She introduced me to this term, to this term of spiritual abuse. And I wasn't comfortable at first, because I was like, oh, I don't know if I can call myself a survivor, because, I'm thinking of people who went to war, people who were, sexually abused, or, beaten, or all sorts of horrific things. But at the same time, there are categories, and what I went through was spiritual abuse, because from the moment I'm a child, I'm kind of forced to think a certain way, and see the world a certain way, adhere to a belief system which had a lot of deceitful narratives in it. And to find out, as an adult, that so many things I was told were wrong, that so many aspects of the stories that were told to me were wrong, and coming to, it's a shock. It's a shock to the system. For some people, it's more gradual. For me, it was very traumatic, because I had given it my all. I could have given my life for the church, and I felt very much deceived when I learned all the stories, especially also with, all the stories of racism within the church, which, were kind of brushed out and washed out and overlooked.
And that's a story, I think, within Christianity in general, is racial kind of undertones around lots of justification for slavery, for all kinds of racial tensions in the name of God. As I just, that's a whole nother podcast, I guess.
Yeah, and I talk about it with Spencer Nugent also, who came on my podcast and talks about his experience as a Black man living in Utah. And Kimberling was on my podcast too, which that hasn't been out yet. But I wanted to hear voices of, people who had, lived it as also Black people being there, because I was kind of in and out and all over. So my experience is a little bit different. And I can't say personally that I have lived racism in the church personally. I know many people have. I have not personally, but that doesn't dismiss, everybody else who has. For me, it was more discovering what the leaders would say, like some of the leaders of the past who were very explicit in their racism. And that was, there's no way I can adhere to. And even and the disavowing is so disappointing to me, because there was never an apology, like a real recognition that this was, that they don't adhere to it, they disavow it, but an apology would be okay, actually needed, not just okay, but needed, because there was a lot of pain inflicted, and there's still a lot of pain. Like Black members of the church are still waiting for that, and I don't know who's going to be the inspired one to do it, but it won't go away. Like it won't go away until it happens. So they might as well do it, sooner than later.
Right.
It's just the way that, policies are made and disregarded, like, like with the children with gay parents a few years ago. You don't just come out and say things like that and come out a few years later and then change things. Like there is a lot of damage that happens in between. And so you'd think that, as quote unquote inspired people, they would know, better than hurt so many people like that. So
yeah, you're absolutely correct. And there are church communities that are good at recognizing the history and offering apologies and restitution. And
the Pope did it, for heaven's sake. The Pope apologized to the indigenous people, like,
Yep. And then there's church communities that are not so great at that.
A lot of pride going on.
Do you have a working definition of spiritual abuse?
Yes. So sorry, I always I'm going off on tangents.
No.
She's bringing me back. Yes.
That's exactly what I wanted us to do, was just talk.
So I am taking the definition that Dr. Matthews used, and she's also quoting others before her, Johnson in 2013. And I can give you the actual quote if you want to have all the references. But it says, spiritual religious abuse is often associated with more radical religions or cults. However, spiritual abuse can be found in many common religious organizations through a variety of leaders and members. These leaders may range from misguided and well-meaning to narcissistic and or sociopathic. Spiritual abuse can be defined as any abuse or trauma done in the name of religion or the deity associated with that religion. Leaders and members may use their religious power and position to coerce, control, and manipulate their members. As justification, spiritually abusive leaders and church members may even say they are speaking for God, quote scripture, or quote from faith leaders, founders, in order to get their own needs met, thus turning the faith from a refuge to an unsafe place. Abusive religious leaders may also devalue and disrespect members both in private and public, and shame and discredit members openly to their congregations. Abuse can also include yelling, threatening, lying, and causing individuals to do things they normally would not do, such as sexual or financial favors. Abusive leaders tend to promote concepts such as not questioning authority, claim they have all the answers, demand allegiance to their religious organization and or deity, use exclusive language about their religion, congregation, cultivate dependency on the leader, and blame members if the members feel harassed or victimized. So I'm sure you can relate to a lot of the things that are mentioned here. I mean, I know I can. And when I read that and other documentation that she shared with me, I was like, yes, I can say that I've definitely been
Are you
in that
comfortable or willing to give some personal examples of how that might have shown up in your life? Because, you start off obviously by talking about this conversion story. Your mother was looking for a community. She found this church community that in many ways was helpful. There were obviously positive aspects of growing up in the church community that you did, as is true of most church communities, right? So I think sometimes when people hear the word abuse,
they can't pinpoint.
Binary, right? Like it's all bad or it's all good, or if it's abusive, there's nothing good about it, right? So it's more complex than that. And I think for us to be open to the idea that there may be spiritual abuses that we are experiencing in our church communities, we have to get away from a binary perspective and see that I could be having some positive experiences here with even positive people, and even good people do some of these things, right?
So I can honestly say that personally, I have not had these experiences, but I can tell you that I have witnessed a whole lot of these experiences since I was a child, going back, because you have to go back usually with, your experiences and to recognize, because it's things that, but I can tell you that in my ward in Belgium, there was at some point an affair with the bishop and one of the young women that I am aware of. That did happen, that many of the adults were aware of. And they tried to fix it with, the clergy, which is completely wrong. This man should have been arrested. And jailed for what he did. I saw in some of my wards, again, like family members, where there was an abusive husband who, when they go and see the bishop, it's the woman is emotional, or she's, and I'm talking about people I know. I'm not just making generalization here. Like, she's too emotional, she's the one who needs therapy, when he's the abusive one, verbally, physically abusive. And he just needs to, pray more and go to the temple more. Like all of these instances, and I can name so many of those, where it's dealt with people who have absolutely zero reason to even deal with any of these issues. They are not trained to do that. And I remember being very active in the church. We lived in Houston, and I was so upset because my visiting teaching companion was 10 years younger than her husband, that she had been counseled by her bishop in Utah to marry in a singles ward. And he was absolutely abusive to her, verbally, close to physically. She was just, afraid and in tears all the time. She ended up divorcing, but it took so long. And she went and asked for help to the bishop, and he would send her back to the abuser. And so the abusive people are protected. When they have, and when I said the abusive, it's the man who have the priesthood because they're man of God and they have the authority, quote unquote, of God. And so they can do no wrong. And I know that they talk about it. I know in the priesthood meetings, they talk about the man and tell them to be better and whatnot, but it's not enough. It's not enough to have all these talks. You have to involve the people who are trained, whether it's, the local authorities or real therapists to do these jobs. It's not the bishop's job to do all of that. So I haven't had myself experiences like that, but I have seen with my own eyes, experience, with people I know, many instances of children being abused, that stories that were covered up. I'm not going to mention name here, but those are people I can see and I know who they are and I know what they've been through because I've heard their stories. Right. And it was all hush hush inside of the church.
And horrible. These are usually under narratives of like being forgiving, be forgiving to your abusive spouse or, narratives, like you said, the priesthood, or, instead of holding somebody criminally accountable, we might just ask them to repent, so it's kind of like a spiritual idea of restitution versus, an appropriate way to restitute. But I would go a step further in the sense, because I think the examples that you're giving are very direct examples, direct things that happened kind of physically, in the bishop's office per se, or et cetera. But I do think that there is something spiritually abusive about certain belief systems and themselves, not without anybody particularly harming you directly. For example, if you grow up in a religious community where being gay is a sin, and, or I know I was told that, I went in and confessed about some premarital sexual activities, that was kind of part of our tradition, was you're supposed to do that. And so then I'm told by a very loving person who I actually still have a lot of regard for, but, he told me, well, that's, a sin next to murder. So now I'm having to deal with this kind of psychological idea that I'm similar to a murderer.
Absolutely.
I was fooling around with my high school boyfriend, right? Something fairly normative human behavior. And so ideas about masturbation or ideas about race, wasn't that long ago, even in this country where interracial marriage was illegal. And seen as dirty in the eyes of God. I mean, it's interesting how humans have used God as a trump card for really harmful, belief systems and narratives. Even I think as a woman, what's our role, and whether or not we're supported in our career identities or our professional identities, because, we're expected to be moms. That can be harmful in regards to human development, right? So it can, I think.
And I've seen a lot of that too. I mean, the suffering, when you come out of the bubble and you come out and start realizing, it just pops in your face. And even when I was in it, I could sense that something wasn't right. I remember a situation where, again, it's people I know, I was at the time close to, but like, the dad is in a position of authority. The daughter is on a mission. She's clearly not fit for it. She comes home, has a mental breakdown, and he's just making her go back when she's not fit for it, not mentally fit for it, not her thing, but because it's going to look bad in the community. So he basically makes her go back. The mother clearly has no say. The mother feels super bad. You can tell that she's in pain for her child, but the authority in the house has to make the final decision, especially because he has this position in the church. And so, how is that going to look? And the whole family lines up behind that quote unquote authority. Disgusting to me that people would do that. And that is a repetitive story that has happened over and over. I mean, you've heard them. Yeah, I can't stand for that anymore. And it's absolute abuse. Or the woman staying in her place because the man has, the last word in the house and he's the head of the house. And so letting things go by that should not go by. And the parent, I think the mothers do take that suffering too, but often don't find that courage. Like they rely on God because that's what they've been told to do, and they'll pray their whole time and their whole life for things to change when they may or may not change. But really, there is other options, and oftentimes when you're in the bubble, you're not aware of those options, or you disregard those options because you've been told that ultimately God's going to take care of it. And that is dangerous. It's dangerous because a lot of people are still today in suffering, in situations where they need to be pulled out because the right actions aren't being taken, you know?
Well, it's interesting too, because, going back to some of our dynamics about people and how it's difficult to change our minds, most of us can probably think of a religious community where we would be like, oh my goodness, I can't believe they believe that, or, oh my goodness, I can't believe they make women wear that type of clothing, or, oh my goodness, I can't believe that they are so oppressive in this one way or another. It's much harder to look at your own, your own community, right? Your own religious teachings and see where might I be missing some things, or if there was somebody else looking into our community, what would they find difficult to believe that we do or we think in this particular way? And I think that that's an invitation I would just put out there, is I think that it's good for us to not be so quick to judge other communities when, maybe there's a stone. Oh, I'm getting Christ teachings coming through my head, right? So, I mean, look at your own, look at the stone in your own eye, right? Before, or the mote in your own eye.
I mean, you saw you saw probably the whole outrage with, that movie that came out, Cuties, which, yes, it's controversial. I have my, would I want my daughter to do that and be there? No, I wouldn't. But to be so outraged and yet not to see what's outrageous in your own home and house and what's happening and how you treat your own gay people, LGBTQ people inside of your wards and telling them they're less than them,
Well, and even the American culture of beauty pageants and dance teams. And I mean, if we're going to start throwing about provocative sexual objectification,
is it because
a lot of work we could do right here?
It's in poor areas versus richer area. I mean, because just go on Instagram these days, and not to say I'm not condoning, but quite frankly, it's all across the board. And then if you're going to act like that, then do it all across the board as well. What's annoying is that they just kind of gang up to shout, oh, scandal. But it's like, can you do that when you see how your church is treating like LGBTQ people and not accepting them properly, and all this suicide in Utah? Like, shouldn't you like scream, oh, scandal, for the leaders to take action on that and be more proactive in preventing these? Like, it doesn't make sense to me. Look what's going on inside of your own home before you try to condemn society. Yes, society is good and bad, clearly.
Yeah, for sure.
But there's a lot of work and cleanup and asking for things to be done, and even to what was done to LGBTQ people back in the days, again, trying to, shove that under the rugs, that, reparative therapy and whatnot that was done right on your ground. It's like, no, take care of that. Come out and say sorry, because people still hurt today. People are still alive who've gone through that, and they've never gotten a sorry for that,
Yeah.
So if you're going to be that way all across the board, and start with your own home,
I love that.
Anyways,
a great invitation. Start in your own home. And I think that's, in a sense, really what we're doing with our own individual work, as well as we're starting in our own home, our own body, our own mind, our own lenses, that we've been influenced by so many things. We think we're so smart and independent, but really we're mainly pack animals that are influenced by so many things, and most of our ideas aren't that unique. And so we need to be willing to look at, where are these ideas coming from? How have I been informed? How does my system and my wiring continue either things that are not helpful and useful for me, or can I move in directions where maybe there's some more health and some more well-being in that journey?
Yes, absolutely. Two books I would recommend that you probably read already that I'm diving into right now is one is The Body Keeps the Score.
Yes.
And then Behave. Behave is a little bit more hefty and psychological book, but it really helps dissecting, why you do this, the things you do. I mean, it goes a lot into trauma, of course, and how to reset, our brains that have been really set a certain way and decide, what is it I want to be and how can I heal from all the trauma, because we all have them.
Mm-hmm.
I want to kind of limit the damage because I know we all do it with my kids,
Right.
I'm like, okay, how can I limit the damages? So that is by
there is going to be damage.
Yes, there is. There is no. Yeah, that's why society is imperfect, because we all are imperfect. But if we can, try to not repeat some of the things that have damaged us, that's where it starts to better ourselves and the future generations.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Julienna, it's been so awesome to have you. What if anything have I not asked you about that you're just like dying to share with us? Like in particular in this theme of journeying from one kind of mind frame to another, and where you're at in that space.
Do me a favor and vote well. No, I would encourage people to do that self work. It's hard, but question your grounds.
Well, and I'm not
Ask why.
I'm not shy with political leanings that have to do with mental health. So when you say vote well, what are you hoping people are voting around? What issues are you hoping they're considering?
Vote for the candidate you really believe is going to hurt the less people overall, because a lot of people are hurting, and you have to wonder and ask, why are they hurting? And it's not just about Black Lives Matter. It's a lot of people in a lot of different spheres. It's women, it's teachers, it's, doctors and nurses, and, a lot of people are hurting right now. And you have to go to look at that hurt and ask why, instead of protecting your comfort. And I speak, as someone who's somewhat definitely in a comfortable area, and I could easily dismiss, because the writing is not happening outside of my door. The people who are screaming and hurting are not close to me. I could totally dismiss and be more afraid for, what's going to happen to, my suburb. I just want to encourage people to dig into the pain instead of, placing these kind of sticker judgment on what's happening and listening. Even don't listen to the leaders, just do your own research. Do your own research and go find out why, and why are things repeating themselves like that, and do the same with yourself. Like, just dig inside, dig deeper to, how can I be a better person, and what do I need to change? I think we all have space for that. What do I need to change to be a better person, parent, friend, whatever it is, So that's what I would say.
Okay. Go vote, make your vote count, and vote for mental health, relational health, community health, right?
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes. There's that involved too. Think of the women anyways, we're going to have to do this again. There is a lot more to talk about.
I'll come on your show next.
Yes.
And then we'll do that.
I will need to prepare myself, but I want to have you on, and we're going to pull some of those things we kind of maybe mentioned, but didn't dig into. So,
yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for your time today. I hope that your journey continues in lots of fascinating ways. Good luck with next week's conference. For those of you who are listening, this is the Healing Souls podcast. Feel free to make a donation if you would like to support this work. You can do that on my website, natashahelfer.com. Tune in next time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Natasha.
Time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the no, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade no, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade no, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland